Good evening. Thank you for braving the rain tonight. We've had a nice response today. We had 90 signups and several phone calls today, so definitely a topic that people are interested in. Is it not on? Yes, it is. Is that better? Thank you, Doug. Tonight's the sixth and final lecture in this series, sponsored by the Watershed Freshwater Forum at Cranbrook Institute of Science and the Nature Conservancy. We're ending on an appropriate note. Helen Taylor is going to be here. She's here, actually, to talk to us about land conservation. And I think that's a nice closing point on what, in essence, is a campus that ended up being land conservation in its own way. So before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Northern Trust and Michigan Radio, as always. We're very grateful. Thank you, Fred Adams, for being here. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to do this, and we really appreciate it. Additionally, this Sunday, I'd like to let all of you know that the Cranbrook Art Museum, in partnership with the Institute, is hosting their studio art sale and community day from noon to 5 p.m. Tickets are $15 and include admission to both the science and art museums, as well as a return ticket for a visit to the gardens in May. The studios will be open. There'll be campus tours. Children 12 and under are free. It's a great community day. It's something we do once a year. It's a chance to actually meet the artists who are studying at the Academy and see the art that they create. So it's a really fun event. It's supposed to be 50 and sunny Sunday, so it'll be better than today, but it is 3 days out, so don't hold me to that. As I mentioned, Helen Taylor is here. Helen has spent more than 25 years working on Great Lakes protection, policy, and conservation. She joined the Nature Conservancy in 1996 to lead its Great Lakes program, and since 1999 has served as state director of the Michigan chapter. She also serves on the board of the Conservancy's Great Lakes Project. Prior to joining the Conservancy, she spent 9 years working in the environmental policy field with a concentration in Great Lakes issues, pollution prevention, waste, and public involvement. Helen was recently appointed by Governor Snyder to serve as a commissioner and is representative on the Great Lakes Commission. The Commission's mission is to promote the orderly, integrated, and comprehensive development, use, and conservation of the Great Lakes Basin water resources. In March of 2003, Helen was appointed by Governor Granholm to serve on the Michigan Land Use Leadership Council, and also was appointed by Governor Granholm to serve as a member of the Agricultural Preservation Fund Board from 2004 to 2007. Currently, Helen serves on the editorial board of advisors for Bridge Magazine and the board of directors for Sustainable Waterworks. She also serves on the external advisory board of University of Michigan's Herb Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise, the Department of Environmental Quality's Water Use Advisory Council, and on the board of the Heart of the Lake Center for Land Conservation. Helen holds a degree in philosophy from Northwestern University, where she graduated with honors. I apologize for reading the whole thing. You asked me to keep it short, but you deserve it. Lastly, Helen was absolutely instrumental in putting together this series of lectures, so it's a pleasure to welcome you, and very appropriate to close the series with your lecture. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It is such an honor to be here. And those of you who have been here for the bulk of the series have just seen the best of the Nature Conservancy. I am the luckiest person, I think, in the world to work with people like the folks that have been presenting to you, incredible scientists, incredibly smart, and so dedicated. And I hope this series has been an opportunity for you to understand how we take science and knowledge and apply it to complex problems in the world and end up with really tangible, lasting results. And it's really just been tremendous to work with Cranbrook. Pairing two science-based organizations has just been a great result for us, and we just hope we can continue series like this in the future. So for those of you that haven't been at the previous sessions, we always just like to start with this first slide, just to make sure you know who the Nature Conservancy is. We're the largest conservation organization in the world. We have 3,500 staff around the world in 35 countries. We're 60 years old. About 750 of the staff members are scientists, and our mission's pretty straightforward. We're trying to protect the lands and waters that all life depends on, and our vision is to leave a sustainable world that provides for future generations. Now, this series has actually focused on some of the most complex, difficult work, issues like climate change, invasive species, water quality, sustainable forestry. But the journey for the Nature Conservancy and conservation did not start out with such complex problems. And that's why I'm closing this series with discussing that changing scale of conservation. And our journey really began way back in very simple terms in land protection. But I thought it'd be instructive to actually go back a little further and just give you an understanding of the conservation movement's history. And the words conservationism, environmentalism, didn't really emerge in the political debates and rhetoric until about 1850 to 1920. And a lot of folks actually associate the conservation movement beginning with Thoreau and his walks in the woods. But eventually then, during that period of time, three positions essentially emerged. And the first is the laissez-faire position, which literally translated in French means let them do it, let it be. And this concept was really about believing the fact that public landowners ought to be able to do whatever they want with their land. Now, the next position that emerged, led primarily by Theodore Roosevelt, was the conservationists. And you might think of them as practical resource conservationists. They thought laissez-faire was really wasteful, inefficient, and they really pushed for long-term, larger-scale planning. They very much believed in using the land, and therefore set up systems like the U.S. Forest Service, but they also recognized the need for setting land aside, and that's why we have all the great national parks we have. But they definitely were interested in economic benefits from natural resources. The third position that emerged during those beginning years was the environmentalists, led by people like Aldo Leopold, Muir, and they were really preaching that nature is sacred. They didn't really want anybody to touch it. A little bit of tourism was okay, but they were definitely against things like timber cutting on public lands. So those of you who know the Nature Conservancy probably wouldn't be surprised that the way we've approached things is really kind of casting across all three of those positions. And it's really, our approach is trying to use science and a non-confrontational approach to strike the defining balance among all three of these positions. And in many ways, this search for balance or for sustainability is actually what's driven the changing scale of conservation that I want to talk about tonight. So I thought I'd actually take you back a little bit to the history of the Nature Conservancy when it began 60 years ago. And this was when we bought our first land parcel in New York. And that purchase in Mears Glen in New York was absolutely the most radical thing. No one had just gone out and bought it. And the people in this image actually mortgaged their houses, pooled their money, bought those 60 acres, and it was the most radical thing at that time. No one had just gone out and done it, put their money where their mouth is. And many conservation organizations you know today, not sure if you knew this, were spin-offs of the Nature Conservancy. Conservation International, Trust for Public Lands, Conservation Fund. But this was really the first time anybody had ever done this. Mianus Gorge, I think I mispronounced it first. And so, fast forward, the organization over time has protected 120 million acres around the world. 120 million acres. That's a lot of land. And we're actually really proud of the land that we protected in Michigan, contributing towards that. So I thought it'd be worth it, in this understanding of where we started and how we've gotten to these more complex issues, to at least take you on a thumbnail sketch, a little virtual tour of some of the places we protected. And the truth is since I had the podium, I couldn't resist showing you some of my favorite places around the state. And I really hope at the end of this you'll actually decide to visit us. All the images on this map, all those different polygons and circles and triangles, are places that the Conservancy is actually protected in perpetuity. Now, we don't own all of these places. All of this adds up actually to 370,000 acres, all told, over the last several decades. The little purple triangles are properties that we actually purchased, but then we transferred. I mean, our goal is not to own land. Our goal is to actually achieve the conservation outcomes. So if there's a partner or an organization that can actually take care of it better than us, because they're there and they can, then we're happy to share that with them and they can actually carry the mission forward. So all the purple triangles are actually places that eventually became state parks, local parks, or maybe a land trust now owns it and takes care of it. The bright yellow triangles are places that we were critical partners in making happen the deal. So in some cases, we actually raised the money or we negotiated the deal and then we handed it off to a partner organization to carry and finish the project. The red circles are actually conservation easements, and that's a tool where we don't actually own the land, but we actually own rights in the land. And those rights actually constrain how the land is used forever. So it might determine that a footprint of a house is all you can build and no place else because we're trying to protect a certain habitat on that property. And those rights and lands come to us because either they're donated by property owners or we buy them. But it's a much more cost-effective way for us to actually achieve our conservation outcomes. And the remaining orange dots are the ones we actually own now. 34 of them, 45,000 acres. And I actually thought I'd just take you on a real quick tour of some of them because I want to entice you to actually join us and actually take a hike someday. So the Grand River Headwaters, some of you may have actually read a column that I wrote just a week ago in Bridge Magazine. It was kind of celebrating that it's springtime and I couldn't wait to go to the Grand River Headwaters. Some of you may not realize the Grand River is the longest river in Michigan, 252 miles, and our work is concentrated in the headwaters. We own about 450 acres, and you can see these beautiful fens and wetlands. But what I love most about this place, and we still have a lot of work to do. You can see where we own what's in the red polygons, and there's much more to protect, a lot of invasive species work, et cetera. But what I love about this place is there's actually really a pond that actually starts the river, and then there's a trickle of water that comes out of it, and you can actually stand with your left foot on one side and your right foot on the other, and you're actually straddling the Grand River. And this is a river that I drive by every day, that I drive over every day on the way to work. It runs by our offices nearby. It's huge when it goes through Lansing, and it travels all the way out to Lake Michigan, but I just love the fact that I can actually start at the beginning, and I know where it starts, and we're working really hard to protect those headwaters because it's vital to the health of the whole. The next one is Saugatuck. I think about half my gray hair comes from this project, I have to say. Very tough project, but we're really proud to be part of it. And the area that you see shaded in orange is actually the shoreline that was protected. The thing that steals my heart about this project is this community has been trying to buy this property since 1952. For 60 years, they have tried and tried and tried. So we were so proud to enable them to have it. And it's not just that it's a beautiful place that you can tell from the images, but it's absolutely in all the postcards, and it's the absolute center of their economic best asset, the beach, that brings in millions of people, and it was at risk of a development. And so it was really at the heart and soul of Saugatuck and needed to be protected. So that's a beautiful place. It's now owned by the city of Saugatuck and managed by the Land Conservancy of West Michigan, who we partnered with and helped make this happen. Point Betsie, some of you have been to the Point Betsie Lighthouse maybe? This is our preserve. The orange part is what we own, about 150 acres, iconic lighthouse up there. You may not realize we own the land next to it. Beautiful dunes, as you can see from the aerial shot. We came there for piping plover and pitcher's thistle pictured here, endangered species. A gorgeous place, one of our most popular preserves, and actually for quite a number of miles, one of the only public access places where people can actually go and enjoy the beach in that area. Garden Peninsula. You know, I'm amazed at how many people don't know or have never heard of the Garden Peninsula. It's northern Lake Michigan. If you actually are in Wisconsin and you know where Door County jets out and then the Garden Peninsula comes down to meet it, so it's coming jetting out. Really interesting place. In fact, I'll use the pointer so you can see what land I'm talking about. Right up here, we've protected about 9.3 miles of shoreline. It's near Fayette State Park, which is probably one of the most gorgeous bays in Michigan. Huge dolomite bluffs. Interesting landscape. The beach is large flat pieces of limestone, the kind you would actually put on a patio or something, and the whole beach is made up of that. You can construct a chair to sit in. It's like a playground of building blocks. Really, really different. Absolutely gorgeous. And we protected, it's about, I think it's 1,100, I gotta look at my notes, yeah, 1,152 acres. A beautiful place. The Keweenaw. The Keweenaw, who's been to the Keweenaw? Have very many people been to the Keweenaw? Oh, that's so excellent. This is truly a very special place. It is worth the long drive, We've actually protected 14 miles of the tip. A lot of people don't realize that. And all the color that you see on this map, actually, we did those projects, but we don't necessarily own all of them. So when you look across the end, the tan area, that's actually now all owned by the state of Michigan. But the part that I think is just so gorgeous, this tall kind of column is 5 miles of the Montreal River, which is cascading into Lake Superior in that upper right photo. And you can walk all the way up it. It's beautiful. The green areas are our preserves that we still own. The Mary McDonald Preserve, the one on the tip in green up on the north side, that's my husband's favorite preserve of the Nature Conservancy. All red, iron-filled stone, stone cobble. It's just so different, so beautiful. And that's about 1,500 acres. The red is actually Brockway Mountain, so if you ever drove to the top of a mountain while you were there, that actually was privately owned and went up for sale and was at risk of development. And the Audubon Society rallied everybody, we all pooled our money, and actually it was just protected this last year. So that's the red. And then to the left, in the green, the very large tract, and this is another 1,500 acres, that's Mount Baldy. If any of you know Helmut and Candace Stern from Ann Arbor, a lovely couple, incredibly generous, made that possible, and that's the mountain in the lower left picture. This is a place that families go every year for summer. There's people with deep traditions of going to the Keweenaw, and that's the mountain they think of that they climb every summer. It's like their Mecca. They go to the top to pick their blueberries, and in the olden days, the children would wave a flag and let the elders down in the town know that they had finished and made it to the top. Incredible history. Helmut said it was probably the single greatest philanthropic gift he gave in terms of him realizing the impact on the community, because the community poured out to let him know what it meant to them to have it saved. Two-Hearted. This is Hemingway's famous big two-hearted river watershed. And those of you who are trout fishers, everybody knows it really wasn't the two-hearted he was writing about. It was the Fox River, but you never tell where your trout are coming from. I guess it's a big secret when you find a place. But in another project I'll tell you about, we actually got the Fox River headwaters protected too. That bright green area is our McMahon Lake Preserve, and that's about 3,000 acres, beautiful pattern wetlands and peatlands. And then the orange actually is what you learned about when John Fosgate was here in the series talking about sustainable forestry. So we call that our Two-Hearted Forest Reserve because we actually are harvesting timber and practicing sustainable forestry practices there. But if you look at the whole watershed, you can see how much of it, the tan is all in state ownership. The orange is our working forest, but we own that. The green we protected. Almost the entire watershed is now protected. Fantastic. About 28,000 acres is what is our total ownership and protection there. Oops, I went too far. Grass Bay, coming down over the crest of the Mitten near Sheboygan. Grass Bay, almost 3 miles of some of the most gorgeous shoreline. And if some of you may own the books, Michigan's Flora and Fauna, written by Dr. Ed Voss, very famous man. We were sorry to lose him. He passed away in the last 2 years. This was his favorite preserve. And I have met so many scientists from across the country who are so jealous that Michigan had an Ed Voss. Because Ed Voss wrote the most amazing, I mean, these are the books that talk about Michigan's flora and fauna if you really want to own the best reference books you can. And this was the place he brought hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of University of Michigan students to teach them botany and such, because he loved this preserve, because he could stand in certain places and point out 10 different conifers of the 12 that exist in all of Michigan. Experiences like that, being able to walk along with Ed Voss like this would bring it alive. You can tell we have some in-holdings we're still trying to protect in that area. We have about 800 acres here, and hopefully we'll complete those over time soon. Erie Marsh Preserve, now we're down by the Ohio River, 2,200 acres, coastal wetland marsh. I know some of you have been there. Beautiful for wild migratory fowl. The exciting thing is in about, I don't know, about a month or so, we're going to turn over dirt because we got a huge public grant from NOAA to absolutely restore the whole thing. This is a diked wetland system, and we are actually opening some of it up for the first time in 60 years so that there can be fish passage between Lake Erie and the marsh, and it's going to actually help create more biodiversity, eradicate our Phragmites problem. Beautiful. And actually, if you go there in the next, I don't know, in just a few weeks, it'll probably be the most perfect time to see some of the most unbelievable migratory birds, millions of birds coming through the migratory flyway, warblers, et cetera. A great place. And the last one, I'm going to actually show you a slide at the end because we have a field trip coming up at Sharon Hollow. This is near Chelsea. This is one of our most popular preserves. Has anybody heard the peepers already starting the frogs? Okay, you almost have to wear earmuffs at this place. They're so loud. This is the peepers, salamanders coming out under the logs, a nice boardwalk for children to walk so they don't get stuck in the mud. I lost a boot in the mud here one time stepping in, and it just never came back. My foot came out, but just a beautiful, beautiful place, and just well worth the visit, and I'll tell you about a field trip that's coming up soon. Okay, isn't that great? That's a lot of land protected, 370,000 acres. A lot of people would be really proud of that. We are proud of it. It's, well, yeah. But that's not my point. That's not my point. Guess what? It's not enough. It's absolutely not enough. And those of us in the conservation field began to awaken and realize we were not going to achieve our mission through land protection alone. It's still a vital part of what we do. But when we bought some of those properties, we weren't thinking about invasive species. We weren't thinking about water quality and water demand. We weren't thinking about the impacts of a changing climate. And so we began to realize in the field of conservation, we're not really going to protect them if we actually just do it piece by piece. So the other factor is that, and a long time ago, we probably, admittedly, were thinking really just about protecting nature for nature's sake. But the reality is we have to think about people are in that picture and the uses of nature. That practical conservation side. We have to actually account for all the services that nature needs to provide, and we have to figure out how to protect those going forward if we want to have a sustainable, healthy Earth for future generations. So we can't do that side by side. I think this is an interesting quote because it really changes how you're thinking from site to systems, that our conservation success will be judged by the ecosystem processes that we protect, not the short-term species of a few small areas. And so you can begin to think where we had to expand our thinking because we weren't thinking at a scale that was adequate to protect those processes that assure that the places that I showed you can continue to thrive. And you saw this slide if you were at our first presentation with Patrick Doran. We had to begin to think about all the services that nature provides: food, fiber, the regulating services of regulating climate. These are, and we don't walk away from the fact of the cultural and spiritual side as well. We have to think about all these things. And if we're trying to do that at the proper scale, we have to expand our thinking and our strategies beyond land protection. So, I'm going to stay there for a second. The best way I can think of explaining, well, the most common question I should say that I hear is how in the world do we decide what to do? How do we not get overwhelmed, just overwhelmed with the complexity of what's going on? How do we choose what to do? How do we decide the next step? How do we make sure it's not random and ad hoc? How do we not get distracted with the next trendy opportunity? And so I'm going to try to tell you 3 short stories and take you on the journey of how we have changed the scale of our conservation thinking and illustrate the answer to that question by how we've done that. And it's so interesting working for the Nature Conservancy because every 5 years or so we look back and we go, what were we thinking before? How could we not have seen that? So it's a fearless organization, and the conservation movement has to be adaptive to actually continue to push the envelope out, to think at the right scale. So this is how we've done it. I'm going to take you back to Point Betsie. Now remember, we went there for piping plover and pitcher's thistle. And we had a first parcel by a generous family, the Zetterberg family, who gave it to us. And we expanded from that first donation. But there was kind of a natural design to the preserve, and we still hope to protect what's north of that with easements. But we began to actually realize there was this plant everywhere, And yes, this is baby's breath that's in your boutonniere, which looks like a really sweet little plant, but it is a really mean plant. It's a bad plant, and it has a taproot the size of Montana, I swear, that goes way deep, and it anchors the dunes, and it crowds out everything else. And it actually, dunes are dynamic systems that have to move, and the sand has to cut across. And this plant, which we learned through research, its epicenter of invasion was right near our preserve. Farmers had brought it in, a good cash crop, and then it kind of took off. And so now a lot of people might look at that picture and say, wow, that's really pretty. That's nice soft grasses, but it's a monoculture. It's not supposed to look like that. And this was what our preserve looked like before 2006. This is what it's supposed to look like. A diverse suite of species. If you look to the left, you'll see how it's untreated, and to the right where it's treated. So you can see the contrast. Well, the problem is we were in this little white square. This is the preserve. And this image always makes me think of my yard, because we could sit there and garden our preserve all day and clean up all those invasive species, but the problem is if your neighbors still have all this baby's breath, it just keeps coming back. And that's kind of what the dandelions are like with my yard, with the neighbors. I'm not proud to say, but you just have a neighbor that keeps giving you the weeds back. So we had to begin to think at a bigger scale, because we were realizing baby's breath was traveling up to Sleeping Bear Dunes and south, but lots more north because of prevailing winds. So we had to begin to change the scale of our thinking. So what we did is we started to walk the shoreline. We actually had scientists walk the entire freshwater dune system shoreline with permission to private landowners, and we began to realize it's not just baby's breath. It's about other invasive species, limegrass, Phragmites, Japanese knotweed. And we began to realize the only scale to think about this is the whole freshwater dune system, which I'm sure many of you know is the largest freshwater dune system in the world. The only way we can combat this is actually to work together. And we can't do all this. So we lead now something called the Michigan Dune Alliance. And these are our partners. And these are all the land trusts, many of you I bet you know, all up and down the shoreline, that together, using that core science that we produced, we now, through generous donors like Meyer, the store system, they, for 6 years, have given us private resources that have leveraged hundreds of thousands of dollars in public grants that we then share with our partners. And we have SWAT teams managing these species all up and down the shoreline. And it doesn't stop there. What's interesting about this is we have to figure out, we could be doing this for a long time, but what science can help us understand is what's that tipping point that we have to manage these species down to. There's a point where you have to just go in and start to really eradicate and get and tap down that invasive plant. But what we're, through experimentation and plots and comparisons, what we're learning and figuring out is what's that tipping point that you can manage it down to that's optimal for cost effectiveness so the plant just doesn't take off. And if you can manage it down and really know what that scale is, then you can actually visit the site once a year, maybe once every 2 years, and just knock off those volunteers that show up. Because we know we're not going to get rid of the entire seed bank, but we've had a 10-year goal with just with just the baby's breath, and we're 6 years in, and we're at 70% of our goal of eradication from the coastal shoreline. So we're well on our way and we're ahead of schedule. But what we hope to do is, if we actually understand what that tipping point is, that we can get out of this job, because what we want it to be is the way we have to live in the world. Just the regular cost of business of owning shoreline. And so there are dune associations of neighborhoods that they assess a fee among, just to snowplow their driveways, et cetera, add a little bit, get a landscaper in there, we'll teach you, and eventually, once we get it ratcheted down, you can actually manage it, and it's just the way they live in the world, and they want to, because invasive species actually really affect your property values. You don't want it all filled with Phragmites. So as you see, we're trying to use science to understand how to manage these things and adapt to them going forward. Okay, story number 2. I'm going to go to forest now. This map is land ownership about 12 years ago. And all you really have to get from this map is there's about 5 colors. 5 colors of owners, meaning with 5 relationships back then, you could know who pretty much owns all of the Upper Peninsula. And so it was a pretty simple playing field of conservation. But things began to change pretty dramatically. And 12 years ago was when a lot of the big paper companies, the green colors are state and U.S. forest ownership. But the colors are actually, back then, were the big paper companies, the same names as on the reams of paper that you buy for your copier, Mead, International Paper. These were the companies that owned the land, cut the trees, made the paper, owned the mills. And they began to realize, wow, we don't really need to own this land. We just need access to the timber. Land's worth a lot. What if we sell it? We'll just get contracts for the timber. And we can actually offset and unload some debt that we're carrying as big companies. So they started to sell. And what was happening was small, limited partnerships of investors from out of state were coming in. They were the buyers. And they weren't really intending to own it for a long time. Their interest was buy the land, cut those contracts with the timber companies, cut it a little harder to make a little bit more, break it up, sell some lakes off and to second home developers, and really fragment it. And by breaking it down and reselling, they'd make a lot, quite a lot, and actually pay off their shareholders, and they'd get out in about 5 to 10 years. It was an enormous seismic shift that was going on in the UP at this time. And the first ones to actually start to sell were lands owned by the descendants of this guy, King Kamehameha. If anybody actually saw the George Clooney film, Descendants, okay, so the big family of ownership were really, it was kind of a veiled, it was actually based on the Kamehameha Trust. And so this map, I need to translate it a bit. The green lands, again, are state and federal ownerships. The yellow are the big public set-asides. Pictured Rocks, Seney Wildlife Refuge, Tequanimon Falls, Porcupine Mountains on the west. So those are the big bricks of set-aside. So it's all the red and orange that was owned by the Kamehameha Trust. And they actually owned a lot more, but this was the part we zeroed in on. And so when you look at it in this way, you see that it's almost like the red and the orange is the mortar in between the bricks of these large public protected areas. So it may not even be the most pristine land, but it was actually the connective tissue, the fabric that held together the forest matrix. That's what made this land so important. And what we began to realize is, to think at this scale, we had to begin to think about values other than biodiversity. We couldn't buy all that land. That was about $150 million worth of red and orange that I was just showing you. What we could do, though, is think about jobs and economy, and because there's only about 300,000 people that live in the UP, and they're either in timber or they're in tourism and recreation, one or the other. That's how you get by in the Upper Peninsula. We had to think about public access, too. When the big paper companies own these lands, actually, part of the deal is they get a low tax rate for public access for hunting and fishing. So people had grown up being able to access all those lands. When they started to sell, and when there was the threat of sale and the fragmentation and the privatization, that meant you couldn't just walk across those places people had grown up camping. So that was a huge issue. And if you lose that, you're actually undercutting your tourism and recreation industries. The actual timber companies were freaking out too, because they actually like large intact forest landscapes. If they have to kind of go around all these private owners, it's actually a lot more expensive, makes them less competitive in the market. So they were upset. And then the local tax base, we had to think about that. If we went in and bought a lot of land as a nonprofit, we couldn't decimate the local tax base. We had to make sure there was private ownership to protect that. Ultimately, our interest was the biodiversity. So what were we going to do? Well, we found that through the idea of the working forest of the easements that I talked about earlier, what if we crafted a working forest easement? One where the property stays in private ownership, but we buy the rights that would assure sustainable forestry practices. What if we bought public access forever? What if we made sure that you could only split the land so many times so it was in large, intact pieces that then the forest industry wins? And ultimately what we did was we came up with, we finally call it the Big UP deal. We kept the land in private ownership. We thereby protected the tax rolls. It stays in working lands, but it's done sustainably. And the timber is harvested and required to be harvested under a very reputable certification program, a third-party certification. It's open forever to the public, and it limits the development. Now, we were very thoughtful. In the areas, we had 10,000 acres, I'll show you in a minute, in a minute, a map in a minute, that buffers Porcupine Mountains, but around the city of Marquette. We were very thoughtful to work with them about what do they want to keep in case they grow as a city. So ultimately, it was a new model for conservation. It was a $57 million deal. Some of our foundations in the state, in about 6 weeks' time, committed about $32 million because they saw the vision of a different way of working in conservation. You don't buy it and set it aside. You actually keep it working. You protect all those values that were listed on the earlier slide. And it was the largest conservation project in Michigan's history. So I'm going to show you what it looks like a little bit up close. So that pink polygon, that's the two-hearted watershed. And you can see where the yellow is the McMahon Preserve that I showed you earlier. Now this first click shows you the blue, which is actually that working forest that John Fosgate talked about. But this is the click I really love. Boom. That red is the working forest easement, and you can see how it fills in. I'm going to do it again because I love doing that so much. It's just the shock and awe of that. And there's a lot more that I could show you in a similar way over by the Porcupine Mountains. Like across Pictured Rocks, that's a 30-mile park. We protected 20 miles of the buffer. We buffered 20 miles of it. This red and this whole project actually protected, or linked, I should say, it protected 271,000 acres across 10 counties, but it linked 2 million acres of already protected lands, 2 million. So that's when you see this, those red areas are actually linking together public lands. It was an extraordinary project, but this is the prize. 271,000 acres, as I mentioned, connecting 2 million, but 423 square miles of forest, lakes, and rivers, 517 miles of rivers and streams, 660 lakes. I mean, this could make me weep when I read this. 52,000 acres of wetlands, and 60 miles of buffer to natural areas. Incredible. Incredible. Took 10 years, 2 governors. We started with Engler, who began the process. We didn't go through DNR at first. We talked to him about jobs protection. That caught his ear. And Jennifer Granholm helped close the deal in the negotiation in the final hours. And I just had to show you a few pictures. Look, this is the Two-Hearted River. Just incredible. Just beautiful. Okay, my next story. This one starts with mussels and a cow. The Nature Conservancy, as I mentioned, we focus a lot on endangered species. So in the upper reaches of the Maumee watershed, we bought a place because it was so special because of the diverse mussel populations. And it was one of the last most pristine and healthy populations, but it was declining. So we bought it. And then we began to realize what the threat was. And it was sediment and silt coming in from the banks and snuffing them out. So we looked up and we saw cows in the stream. So the first thing we did was we rolled up our sleeves and we knocked on farmers' doors and we said, hey, do you mind if we get your cows out of the stream? We'll pay for the fences. We'll even dig the post holes ourselves. And farmers said, go knock yourself out. And we got the cows out of the stream. However, then we began to realize, no, there's still something going on. A lot of sediment is coming off of these farms. And we began to look at what they were growing, and we looked at farming practices. And we realized farmers have to get water off their crops really fast. They have to. But they also create more runoff of sediments and silt load by how they till the land. So our next strategy, as this changing scale of conservation evolved, we decided to form a conservation tillage program. And we tried to talk to the farmers about how you don't have to till as much. You can even leave the fodder and the corn stalks on the ground. It'll replenish the soil. And with no till or very low till and using different equipment that we purchased, we tried to sign them up to sweeten it, because I'm not sure they really would do it. They wouldn't do it just because the Nature Conservancy asked them to, because you have to be mindful and respectful of the economics of their craft. So we actually formed a fund and we said, if you don't meet or exceed your profitability in our conservation tillage program, we will make up the difference. And over 20 years, we only had to dip into that fund twice. And so over time, we bought the equipment, we loaned it to them for free, and they'd sign up. They saved gas prices. I was down there one time, and we held up 2 chunks of soil from 2 different locations, conservation tillage and not, and the richness of the soil from not tilling as much was evident. So there were many, many benefits to these practices. Okay, fast forward, not enough. We realized that there were other practices that had to be considered that had to do with that altered hydrology. So we worked with an Ohio State University professor who designed this idea of 2-stage ditch design. If you go to an agricultural ditch, sometimes it's just a scoured, trough, and a lot of erosion, you can tell, goes in. And so they actually designed this because what if, we still have to get the water off, we know that, but what if we can slow it down so it's not so flashy? And by this point, we're not really just focusing on those mussels, we're actually worried about the fish populations. And when you have ditches running water off and the water goes up and down and it's very flashy because big rain events and it's just piling into those systems, it's actually not great for the fish species. Different ones need more stabilization. What happens is the sediments are filtered by the grasses on the banks. You create tremendous habitat for birds. It's a win-win, and then you don't have these dredging fees, because with the other ditches, you have to actually dredge them on a very regular basis. So it's very expensive. But not enough. We're going for the mussels in that little place in the upper reaches, but this is really the scale we began to realize we have to think in terms of. And why? Because the Maumee River watershed actually feeds into Lake Erie. What's happening in Lake Erie? You heard about it, algal blooms. So practices all over this watershed. There's not enough days in the week and hours in the day to knock on enough doors to talk all the farmers into this. We had to figure out higher leverage strategies to help share some of these practices with them. And so we needed tools, and we need to also target where we would have the most optimal return on investment. And that doesn't mean every farmer signing up. You have to just figure out where to go, and you have to provide incentives and make it economically feasible. So we started to work with Michigan State, and we realized we needed tools to actually target and be very specific about this stuff. Now this is actually a still shot of if I had this linked up to this tool that we developed with Michigan State, I could actually draw that red line around that parcel if this was your farm, and then this menu would drop down, and it would actually tell me in real time, based on real data of soil types and hydrology in this watershed. This has to be done for each watershed, and it's now being replicated around for other watersheds. What your practice is, what I'd ask you is, like, you raise corn? Okay, what if you raised alfalfa? And it will tell me what the sediment load difference would be, and it would also tell me about a new issue that emerged over time, was groundwater recharge. There are watersheds in southwest Michigan that are running out of water. Can you believe it? We're in the Great Lakes. But they are under such intense irrigation that they're actually going dry. And so we really have to be able to use science to define the metrics and the limits of the use so we don't go over that line. So there's actually, the state has and we contributed a lot of the science to this, a groundwater recharge tool. So you can actually permit people based on how much water can the system withstand. And it's tools like this that it's helping us make those decisions. But the last piece in the puzzle is, how do you pay for it? And Farm Bill puts hundreds of millions of dollars into farm practices across the country. So the key is making sure that practices like these are on the eligible list so a farmer can sign up and get some help to implement them. And so we've done that. We've actually gotten some of these practices on the state list so farmers can sign up. We've helped farmers sign up. We've given this tool to conservation districts, given the conservation districts money to hire staff to use the tool. And now the key will be, one day, convincing the Farm Bill to target its investments based on how much conservation and water quality you achieve with these tools. Right now, it's kind of whoever comes and signs up, first come, first serve. But we need to have outcome-driven use of these tools. And this is the scale we think at now. So this is the scale of Western Lake Erie, where you see the preserves we visited earlier. And this is the scale where we think, what were we thinking before when we just bought that parcel? Ultimately, all three of these stories and all the places we've talked about fall into the context of the Great Lakes. And that's the system that all of these talks have been in the context of. So if you look at this map, all those yellow dots are our history of protecting places, but all the icons are the demonstration sites to address the issues that you see across the bottom for watersheds, coastal systems, aquatic food web, forests, where we have to experiment, figure out tools and solutions so we can replicate them. But this is the system that we have to think in terms of, and that's the context of our work today. I thought it'd be helpful to show you one slide about the organization globally. You know our mission to conserve lands. Our values are very important: integrity beyond reproach, tangible, lasting results. Blowing it up, I wanted you to see this is the global framework for action for the Nature Conservancy. What I've been describing, what our speakers have been describing through this whole scale of our work, goes all the way up to the top. And we're actually challenging ourselves with global challenges of critical land. What we're seeing is 4 categories of global challenges. In critical lands, restoring our oceans, freshwater, and climate change. And the solutions we're framing under 3 areas: protecting and restoring those natural systems like the Great Lakes, finding the science and defining the metrics of sustainability. And the last one, something we haven't spent a lot of time on over the decades, the Nature Conservancy, we used to have a mantra of quietly conserving nature. And we need to tell people what we're doing, and that's what this series has been about. So we're very grateful to have had the chance to talk with you about our work. But broadening the constituency for conservation is vital for future generations, for political decision-making, and that's why this series and all those that we've been talking to are trying to enhance knowledge of what we're trying to do with our partners. And if you don't believe me, or anybody that's spoken during this series, I want to actually invite you to an unusual opportunity, because our CEO is going to be in town on the 21st, and he's going to be a guest. Actually, Terry Barkley is here. She's a member of our board and actually the CEO of Inforum, a professional women's association. He's coming to their annual meeting. You don't have to be a woman to attend. It's open to everybody. May 21st, there's a luncheon. Please come. He actually just wrote a book called Nature's Fortune, and it is a great message about the business of investing in nature. And he's really helping people see that natural resources, not only does all life depend on them, but there's a way of thinking about it in economic terms that it needs to be at the center of our society, not a philanthropic endeavor. He's a great speaker, a great man, and I really would encourage you, because he's a world traveler. It's very hard to actually have a chance to hear him. I also want to mention the Spring Treasure Hunt, May 4th. That's at the last preserve I showed you. You're all invited. Come hear the peepers. It's a beautiful time of the year with the wildflowers. And that's it. I really, really want to thank you for the opportunity to try to convey the changing scale of conservation and what it's meant for the Nature Conservancy's journey. Thanks for taking the time to be with me, and I'll answer some questions. Any questions? I can't even see. Okay. Yes?
What's the relationship of the Michigan Nature Conservancy to the Ohio Nature Conservancy and the Monmouth Project?
Okay. The question was, what's the relationship between the Michigan Nature Conservancy and Ohio Nature Conservancy? Okay, we're all one organization. First of all, we are the Nature Conservancy, and we have staff in Ohio, Indiana, all the states. And because of work like the Western Lake Erie work, where you're talking about a Maumee watershed that cuts through 3 states, we actually have a project team that's an integrated group from all 3 states. So we pool funding. There's really a seamless effort of looking at the Maumee as a watershed. So the distinction that you're drawing is really just a structural one of who works for who, or our operations, but the work as we apply our conservation is actually, it's a watershed team focusing on the Maumee. Yes?
What is the working relationship with the Michigan Nature Conservancy and other conservation?
I feel bad. I probably should have made a much bigger emphasis on how we never do any of this work alone. It came out with the Michigan Dune Alliance. But our organization Oh my gosh, our partnerships are so vast with whether it's other land trusts in the state, other watershed councils, other science institutions, the universities. We don't want to recreate, being the science epicenter. We have these incredible universities, so we contract with them and collaborate a lot with them. Are you asking specifically about the land trust in the state?
I was thinking more in the bird aspect.
In birds, okay. Well, one of our speakers was Dave Ewert, and he's an ornithologist, and actually our first speaker, Patrick Dorn, is an ornithologist. And so on bird work, we actually collaborate quite a bit. We've actually, over time, had bird work kind of spanning our work in Canada all the way down to the Caribbean and South, trying to, and if you'd heard Dave, I don't know if you came to that one, but we work with a lot of partners along the way to protect stopover sites and figure out where they breed, et cetera. And all that is done actually with partnership with other institutions. The Brockway Mountain with Audubon Society. So it's really driven by the geography. If it's clear that that's of interest or necessary to achieve the conservation outcome, it's an open door. And the truth is it might tell you something about us, is that in many ways, I'm always trying to work my way out of a job. My hope someday is that there isn't a need for these organizations because it's the way we live in the world. And we live in balance, and we understand what that means, and we have the knowledge and the metrics to make the right decisions. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but that's how we think about it. So we're not, our desire is not to become huge or dominate. In fact, we actually would very much, in many ways, when we transfer land, we really try to, if someone else can do it, great, because there's a lot to do, there's too much to do. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, the slide you showed with the map of Michigan, the various conservation areas that you've supported, is that available on the web? Can we look at that for those of us who want to travel?
Sure, oh, absolutely. And I don't know if that exact map is, but the information to actually visit these preserves and such is definitely there. And we're still not perfect with our website and all that stuff, so we're still building things, but we actually have the ability to give you a virtual tour of some of them, and it's getting better every day. And if there's a place you want to know about, just call us. So, yes?
As I've been reading more about monarch butterflies and how they're on the demise, and there's speculation that perhaps because there's not enough milkweed around due to people eradicating it, particularly large-scale farms, that it's going to be more difficult. Plus, there's also climate change and having a big effect on it in the future. Monarch butterflies is. This is one example of how, let's say, large commercial farms and maybe fragmentation of land through overdevelopment is causing a problem for animals and birds. And I'm just wondering if you have some influence on it. Are you somehow entering into conversation and dialogue about what these large farms can be doing to help create more wildlife?
Farms in particular, or just landscape man? Yeah.
Well, particularly large-scale farms, because they, for some time, doing clear cutting. You can talk about lack of pheasant habitat or pheasants,
Right.
individuals in the state, to the fact that even some places across the country, there were many cattle that froze to death in these terrible winter storms because these large farms didn't allow for woodlots.
Right.
It's a problem. Farmers didn't use farming.
Right. Well, so you loaded a lot into that question, so I'm going to do my best. But I understand what you're trying to say. Can we influence the kinds of decisions about large-scale farming, et cetera? And it's about land management practices. And there's many points of entry in that question. There's many points of entry, everything from the Farm Bill down to the individual farmer, everything from the DNR and how they, or the DEQ, how they regulate lands. The privilege I feel with working for the Conservancy and the many partners, so partners either are focused in one of those niches, and you have to have a pretty good sense of civics and kind of decision making about what influences land decision and management. For the Conservancy, we actually go from the science all the way to the policy, but we try to strategically enter the discussion where we think we can throw a big lever, and we never do that where we don't feel we have the science to defend what we're saying. So there's some interesting moments in time right now. There's wetlands reform going on in the state, and we're trying to actually have an influence about those decisions, about how a wetland is defined, how it's managed, how it is protected, because it's one of the most vital components of our systems. Well, farmers, how they treat wetlands is a big part of that. So that policy opportunity is when we'll come in and actually try to provide the science. We try to do it in a way that is respectful of the economics and the needs for food production, but actually making sure that we define how to stay within the bounds of health for those systems. So we can't be everywhere, and so we try to actually point out the points in that decision-making, almost it's a theory of change, if you will, or a site-to-system sort of scale, and find the place where we can have the most impact. So when it comes to monarch butterflies specifically, I can't say that we're actually on that topic, but we're trying to actually help provide the knowledge and infuse in policies the regulatory framework that operates within the lines so that health and resiliency and function can continue. And it's a different point depending on the site versus the forest of the Great Lakes, for example. So we're trying. I'm not sure I answered your question, to be honest, but. Lynn Henning, I don't know Lynn Henning. Okay, what organization is she with? Well, you can ask me later, so I'm really bad with names, so, yes.
This is a little more prosaic, but I get the feeling maybe Harbor Lakes does a little bit of this, but there's no real voice that I see or hear talking about the concerns of the Conservancy area. When I see the state legislature screwing with things like the land trust, and a few other things, trying to limit the amount of land that the DNR can buy with land trust monies. And I don't see any reaction, which I think is what they're doing is probably criminal at some point.
Right. So Heart of the Lakes, I'm on the board, so actually I know the organization well. Heart of the Lakes is actually an organization to give policy voice to the land trusts in the state. And so the members of the board and the members are the land trusts around the state. And we have the benefit of having a policy staff that work on these issues. And there's different tactics. And so sometimes people feel that if they don't see us yelling about it in the paper, that we're not doing anything. Now, we have a non-confrontational approach, and a lot of the land trusts do too. And I failed to say this. It was actually in my talking points that we often describe ourselves as radical center, which means we're being yelled at from both sides. Some people would argue that means we're probably doing something right. But what it means is we try to work with people. Our legislature is new. A lot of them have never done this before, and education is probably one of the most important things. It's your voice that's really important too. We are perceived as an environmental organization by political leaders sometimes, and what they need to hear is from the voters and the people that put them in office. And so sometimes we will arm you with the information to carry those messages. We work very hard to try to help them understand the issues, and sometimes they're getting there before we can, and we're having actually some effective conversations to try to ratchet back some of those legislative bills that have been introduced. It's a very tough time. I'm not sure that we have penetrated on some topics effectively to educate, but we are there behind the scenes extensively, but we don't do that loudly, because the minute you take a position, you lose your seat at the table. And I found that yelling at people doesn't always work. I know it doesn't work with my kids. I will definitely say that. But I find that actually trying to be more collaborative and speaking with science and speaking with facts is the best way. But that's not always what gets the news. You know, what gets in the newspaper is actually the conflict. So you might have some heart that there's more going on behind the scenes. It's a challenge. It's a very challenging space right now in Michigan. Yes?
How did you meet the success dealing with the plan commissioners with the two-stage ditch design? And how would you handle the local road commissions? They have a huge negative impact on the rivers and streams.
So the road commissioners I'll take first. our point of entry on the issue of road commissions is part of it is helping inform where things should go and not. So sometimes when roads are going to be punched in, we can actually try to, and we're consulted for science of like, don't go right through that wetland or things like that. But a big issue for us with road commissioners is actually how they put in their culverts and their road stream crossings. And that's a big issue where, in fact, in the Two-Hearted, we're on our last one where, you know, sometimes you put in these culverts really quick and they're perched and they're up high and, you know, fish can't jump up through the pipe and jump down, and or it's dark and narrow and scary and they won't go through. So there's a way to construct those. We need to make it more cost effective. It's cheaper to put them in poorly. So we need to find an economic way to make that work. But through training, lots of workshops, and raising funds and actually doing it ourselves and contracting out the engineering work, we've actually restored like about 60 miles of the Two-Hearted River for free fish passage. When it comes to drain commissioners, that's a different story. That's a very powerful political position in the state. But working with them, what we're trying to demonstrate is actually two-stage ditch is actually great because it's cheaper. You don't have to dredge as much. It's a win-win. It's all about the economics. We can't do this based on cajoling, convincing, charity. It's got to work in the economic space, and it can. And that's how we're being successful with the two-stage ditch design. It's actually phenomenal for the farmers. The farmers will testify to it. We've got them on video. I mean, there's nothing better than a farmer saying, this is fabulous, I'm saving money, you do it too. That's how we do it best. So, one last question, and then we probably should close, and I'm happy to stay for questions afterwards.
Hi, Helen. Joe McHugh. Thanks again for the talk. You were an exceptionally engaging speaker. I enjoyed it. My question is about broadening the diversity, or rather broadening the number of supporters that we have in terms of conservation. One of the points that you mentioned on the slide. What role does the Nature Conservancy play in terms of going after perhaps low-hanging fruit from a legislative standpoint that may help to increase the awareness on part of the consumer, for example, in terms of conservation, like perhaps just simply expanding the bottle bill?
What was the last part? Explaining?
Perhaps just simply expanding the bottle bill. By that, increasing recycling would improve the awareness of the average consumer and perhaps spur more conservation involvement.
This might be a stumper for me. I mean, the legislature, I'm not sure that our strategies actually think about using the legislature to actually broaden support for conservation. We're probably using different mechanisms like social media with the new generations, et cetera. We're probably focusing more to the question that was asked before to try to get the legislature to understand the importance of conservation. We have to start there before we can actually get them to some of the bills like you're suggesting. They're all freshmen. This is completely new. And I think probably the most important thing is that we need to broaden that constituency to all generations. I will say I never thought about using legislation to actually inform the public. So you've given me something to ponder after this, but I can't say we're doing it. So it'll give me something to think about. Thank you so much for the honor to be here. And happy to answer questions. Thanks so much.
Great job.